And I welcome everyone to Press TV's News Review program, where we get in-depth in one of the day's top stories. The NATO chief has called on Ukraine's military sponsors to focus on sending new weapons in addition to planning on supplying ammunition for older systems.
Battle tanks are important, as are all the other systems. And in addition to new platforms, we need also to remember that we need to not only focus on new platforms, but also to ensure that all the platforms which are already there can function as they should, meaning that we need ammunition, we need spare parts, we need maintenance, and we need training.
Stoltenberg made the remarks on the sidelines of a NATO summit in Germany. The meeting was convened to discuss whether to send modern battle tanks to Kiev. Poland's defense minister said that no decision on supplying the Leopard-two tanks to Ukraine had been reached at the meeting. In recent days, German officials have said that they won't send the advanced tanks to Ukraine and will not allow any other country with the German-made tanks to send them either. The German defense minister says that Berlin is not alone in preventing the delivery. Boris Pistorius said the German government is still weighing the pros and cons of the matter. Washington declared a $2.5 billion military package for Ukraine just ahead of this NATO meeting. And now joining us for the program is Marcia Baker, co-editor at the Executive Intelligence Review. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, joining us out of San Francisco, California. I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Ms. Baker, we'll start with you. Your initial thoughts about, with respect to the fact the West continues to give Ukraine weapons. It hasn't really changed anything on the ground in Ukraine. There are small victories, but ultimately the Russians said that this is an existential threat to our existence. I mean, having NATO win this battle, having them on our doorstep, it's not gonna suffice. We'll never let it happen, even if we have to resort to using nuclear weapons. That does not sound like the kind of jargon you want to keep, fueling the flames of.
Yes, you are right. Another name for what you could call today's meeting in Germany at the Ramstein Air Force Base, which was hosted by the United States for the Ukraine Contact Group to pledge more money and weapons. You could call it Global NATO's meeting for World War III. It's like a planning session, because the escalation that's involved in continuing and escalating to supply arms in a situation where you are promoting conflict with to create an existential threat for Russia is the short road to hell in World War III. I will say that it's not just today's meeting in Ramstein that may have involved around 53 nations, but you had the two-day meeting of NATO in Brussels the last 2 days, and you had a frenzy of transatlantic travel on behalf of this escalation. Briefly, James Cleverly from Britain, the defense secretary, went to Washington, D.C. He went to Toronto to meet with Melanie Joly. You had on the other side the chief of staff of the military for the United States, Mark Milley, reviewing training hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers in Germany. You had the Secretary of Defense of the United States, Lloyd Austin. You had the State Department people, Wendy Sherman, in Kiev Monday, and 10 days ago you had the CIA fellow, William Burns, in Kiev meeting on things. So that's just the public side. The private side is to continue this effort, which I say is, unless it's countered, and there are more voices countering it, we can get into that, but this is extremely dangerous.
Thank you, ma'am. And Scott, welcome to the program. Scott, my initial question to you, what does NATO gain from pushing the Russians into a corner like this? When you weigh the risks and the benefits, What's really at stake here, and why push this thing to this limit? We were mentioning 3 or 4 months ago this thing could get bad with the rhetoric, and pretty much it's getting pretty bad at this point. Your initial thoughts?
Well, the Europeans are in a Yasmin moment of insanity and confusion, and they should be looking for ways to depart from this conflict that obviously the Ukrainians have lost. They've been decimated. 3/4 of their army have been destroyed. They are hobbling back on wooden crutches and on ambulances, shredded soldiers that didn't need to die, but they were cast into the destruction of war by the United States, by the United Kingdom, specifically Boris Johnson, and the rest of the puppets like Macron and Schultz and Trudeau. And this gaggle of fools have had nothing to do and no interest in democracy or freedom. They've had only antagonism against Russia, and I might add Iran and other nations that defy their world order. But they've had an agenda to globalize the world and conquer any nations that stand against that and stand against their hedonistic, humanistic, atheistic worldview. And Russia is one of the leaders. So in this Ukrainian-Russian conflict, Russia has won. It is broadcasting to the Ukrainian soldiers, you have fought the good fight, you have been noble soldiers, but lay down your weapons and return home with honor. Don't surrender and sacrifice your bodies and your families for nothing, and especially not for the European, United States, NATO establishment that do not care about Ukraine. They care about their own selves. And what's going to be interesting are all the weapons that the West sent to Ukraine are going to fall into the hands of dark elements, mafia criminal elements that will then turn them against the Europeans, and you will see Russia lay down an iron curtain, take control of Odessa and other profitable areas of Ukraine, and let Europe be eaten up by the chaos and the violence that these Ukrainian disenfranchised soldiers are very soon going to feel towards their European degenerate liars and manipulators. But perhaps that was Europe's game all along: control its own masses in Europe by triggering civil war, by arming Ukrainians, causing them to become destroyed in war, and then use that as a police state against your own citizens. That's certainly what the pattern is in Trudeau, Biden, Macron, and the rest of these Europeans. So I think Russia has won this, but NATO is a cornered animal, frothing at the mouth, acting like the mad dog it is.
Thank you, Scott. And Ms. Baker, the Ukrainians, they desperately need these, they want these Leopard tanks. They don't have sophisticated tanks. Germany's not giving it to them. And we mentioned in the story, they're not letting their allies give it to them unless they said that Washington first gives them Abrams tanks, which would take almost 2 years for someone to train. The Ukrainians want more sophisticated drones. They want fighter jets. They're getting none of the most sophisticated weaponry that the West has to put at their disposal to get them really back into this fight. They're not giving it to them. The West is not giving it to them. What is the point then to give them just enough to make them bleed out slowly? What is the point here in that kind of policy?
Well, as Scott referenced too, you're looking at insanity on the part of leading figures in the West. And I'll give you an example. January 18th, the New York Times had a story headlined that the United States warms to helping Ukraine target Crimea. Now, that's just another example of the insanity of just continuing a policy as you just heard described, is ruining Ukraine and threatening World War III. Now, in that regard, the leaders doing that, the backdrop to all of this is the economic breakdown of the Western system, where it could be corrected, but you would have to re-regulate banks, stop the speculation, stop the crazy central bank pushing interest rates up or down. And you have had people in the streets this week in Paris, thousands of people in the streets against the nominal question of increasing the age of the retirement from 62 to 64, but it's against austerity. In England this week, you had the nurses on strike. It'll happen again in the next 10 days, and the ambulance drivers. The U.S. may be a little behind, but not much. So we are at a crossroads here, and the voices speaking out, and there are a few. In the United States, you have some retired people, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Colonel Richard Black. These are just a few of the retirees, same as in Europe. And if these are amplified, we can change course just in time. The one thing I'd like to just quickly say is that the Vatican did offer that without any conditions, they would be glad to be a venue for negotiations. We should have peace talks. This isn't a religious question. The Vatican did this at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, supporting the U.S. and the Soviets at that time. So there are initiatives, and the difference needs to be made very quickly.
Thank you, Marcia Baker. And Scott, I'm going to let you get the last word in, but I'd really like for you to weigh in on that question too. The Europeans, billions of dollars in weapons, but not the good stuff. The Americans, $27 billion, and we know that much more has been approved. They're going to go probably, well over $100 billion into this thing before they start opening the talks on peace or whatnot. Help us understand the logic. They're not giving them the kind of stuff. They're helping the Ukrainians bleed to death, and they're not giving them anything that's going to get them back in this fight for them to secure their territory and get those 4 annexed regions back. What's the point, Scott?
Well, you're right, and it was said before. This is a combination of insanity, military-industrial complex bribery, selling of weapons for nothing but profit. All of the best American military analysts and figures who are friends of mine, Doug McGregor, Scott Ritter, Senator Dick Black, I know them well, and we're all in agreement, which should tell you something. We're all in agreement that Russia has won this. The United States is on the wrong side of history on so many different levels. So is the United Kingdom, so is NATO, so is the European Union. I will be coming to Iran in a couple of weeks, and I'll be damned if the United States or Israel or EU or anyone else will stop me from coming to Iran and speaking the truth about these and many other things. And what we've been talking about thus far is the West is in decline. It's about to collapse. Its own people are overthrowing the Western governments because the Western leaders and the politicians seem to think that the Americans, British, French, Canadians, Germans are all a bunch of fools who are full of hatred for Iran, Russia, and other countries and want endless war. They don't. And the people in Europe especially are freezing to death. Their businesses are shutting down. They're losing their heating, and they're going to be overthrowing their government, some would say violently, if they do not immediately cease and desist from waging these wars at taxpayers' expenses. So this has nothing to do with Ukraine or democracy or helping people. It's got nothing to do with stopping Russia, about being a bully. Russia isn't a bully. Russia is actually a savior of the people of Ukraine and the Russian people and culture. And they stepped in to stop a violent menace which was created by the United States in 2007 and the United Kingdom, to stop the biochemical labs that were set in motion by the United States, which have harmed the world with this COVID-19 disease and vaccine that has killed everybody that gets it. So we're witnessing the West engaging in war crimes, crimes against humanity, using Ukraine as a laboratory, using Russia as an excuse. But I think, like that old biblical story of the figure Hamar, who hung himself in his own noose and guillotine, whatever it was, that's coming upon the United States and the United Kingdom and NATO. They're going to see very quickly that they've lost this war, and if they're foolish enough to really pick a fight by firing missiles at Russia or doing a nuclear event, then you're going to see Russia respond with a full nuclear response and annihilate London, annihilate Washington, and annihilate New York. And none of us want that, but we seem to be populated by lunatics in our political class that just don't seem to understand. Nobody believes them but their own reflection. And even that soon is starting to disappear.
All right, I'd like to thank the both of you. It's always a pleasure to have you both on. Ms. Marcia Baker, their co-editor from the Executive Intelligence Review, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, joining us from San Francisco, California. And viewers, thanks for tuning in. This brings us to the end of your Press TV News Review program. Bye-bye for now.